How are you guys this morning?
Good.
Everybody's awake? Who gets up this early, right? This is early. So, how many of you are close with your grandparents? Close? How many of you would do anything they asked you to do? And really, what do they want you to do besides eat? Right? Mostly grandparents eat. At least the Jewish grandparents do, right? Okay, I got somebody who understands. All right. So, a lot of people say, why did you write this book? There are so many books on the Holocaust. Why did you write this book? And the answer is simple. My grandfather asked me to do it. And I'm going to tell you how I came about writing this book. Now, I grew up on Cape Cod in Massachusetts. I'm sure there are no Red Sox fans here. And I knew my grandparents were in this thing called the Holocaust, but when I was little, my parents, nobody really talked about it at my house, and I thought the Holocaust was this bad place. And it wasn't until middle school when we read Night that I started to learn more about the Holocaust, and my mom came into my class and spoke about what it was like to be a child of survivors. Now, they lived here in Brooklyn, Midwood area, Canarsie, around here, and can't tell you what she said because I walked out of the class. At that young age, I was about 12, I had this acute sensitivity to the subject and I wasn't ready to hear the details. So when I was in college, I accidentally discovered a family secret. Turns out my maternal grandmother, the woman I was named after, did not die of cancer as I'd been told, but she committed suicide. So I'm 18, I find this out, and I called the one person who I really thought would be able to tell me why, and that was my grandfather. And I said, Papa, why did Fela commit suicide? And there was no answer on the other end. It was silence. And finally my grandfather spoke, and he had never spoken about her suicide ever. They'd been lying about it for over 20 years. And I don't know if it was because enough time had passed or because he and I were so close, but he finally told me why. But in order for him to talk about her suicide, he had to first talk about another subject he never spoke about, and that was the Holocaust. So my grandmother lived in Lodz, Poland, which became the Lodz ghetto. And she was the youngest of 11 brothers and sisters. Could you imagine? Never get in the bathroom, right? 11 brothers and sisters. Almost right away, everybody was murdered, killed almost right away. And at one point, she was about 13, 14 years old. She was in a room with her oldest sister and the sister's twin boys who were 3 years old. And one day, 2 Nazis stormed in and they took her sister. And as they're dragging her out, she's screaming to my grandmother, promise nothing should happen to my sons. Promise you'll take care of them. Now, I know if that was my sister, of course I would promise, and I'm sure you guys would do the same thing. Well, not too long after this, the Nazis came back, and guess what they wanted? The boys. And they took these twin boys. And my grandmother, like I said, was 13, was skinny, hungry, grabbed, tried to fight them, and she was no match for these Nazis, as you can imagine, and they took the boys. Well, my grandmother felt so much guilt after this, and you can imagine. Well, it was not too long after this, the Nazis came back, and this time they took my grandmother, and they took her to Auschwitz. Now, you've all heard of Auschwitz, right? Pretty scary place. And when she got to Auschwitz, she saw what they did to little children, and she realized what had happened to her nephews. You know, kids were ripped apart in tug-of-wars, smashed against walls, thrown into pits of fire, and she saw this. And she realized this is probably what happened to her nephews. And the guilt she felt just grew. And that guilt stayed with her while she was in Auschwitz, and later when she was in Bergen-Belsen, and even 20 years after that, when she was living here in Brooklyn with a husband and 3 children. They owned a business, they owned a grocery store not far from here. And it was too much. The guilt just came back. She had tried so hard to forget, but it was too much. And the only way she could get rid of that guilt was by taking her own life. And you see, I still get emotional from it, but my grandfather tells me this, and I'm thinking to myself, wow, you know, cancer didn't sound so bad. So at the time I was in college, and I was recruited to play 2 Division I sports in college, but I ended up not playing because it was just too much time. So I started writing. Now, when I found this out, I decided to write an article for the paper, and I wrote about my grandmother, about the Holocaust, about her suicide, and I got all these letters. I got so many letters, but the most significant feedback that I got was from my grandfather, because he finally felt relief having unburdened himself from that secret. I'm sure you know what that's like. If you have a secret, you have to tell someone. So he felt better having told me. And that's when he said, you know, I want you to tell my story. I want my children and my grandchildren and now great-grandchildren to know how I survived. And he survived by working hard and being lucky. But the significance of survival, what really pushed him to survive, was that every day for 5 years when he was in the camps, every day he believed that one day he would have a wife and children and more family to replace all those that were murdered. So like I asked you, would you do anything your grandparents asked you to do? Of course I said yes. You know, my grandfather's never asked me for anything except to eat more. So I said yes, plus I figured how hard could it be? Tell me a story. I write it down, make copies, I'm good. I had no idea it would take 18 years to finish this book, or that it would be read by thousands of people around the world or endorsed by Elie Wiesel. At that point, it was just as a favor to my grandfather. So we started to work on the book, and I worked with him while we were here in Brooklyn or in Florida in the winters. And at the beginning, I had a tape recorder. Do you guys know what tape recorders are? Okay. And pen and paper, and we're all set to go. And my grandfather said, well, where do I begin? Well, I had no idea how to write a book, and I said, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? And the first thing was a story from his family, from his childhood with his brother and his 5 sisters and his parents and his bar mitzvah and going to the temple and how great he felt, and how a couple years later most of those people would be murdered in the Holocaust. And then he remembered a story from Treblinka, where they were woken up in the middle of the night, all the prisoners, and put in a circle. And they took one prisoner, and this Nazi held up a potato, and he said, this prisoner stole this potato from the mouth of a pig, but a Jew is no more important than a pig. And he shoved the potato in the prisoner's mouth, shot him in the face, and dragged them around. And my grandfather then slowly is remembering these stories. And you know when you squeeze a sponge and you squeeze a little and a few drops come out, but the more you squeeze, the more water comes out. Well, my grandfather's memories were like this. For years and years, he had tried forgetting all this because it was too much, it was too difficult. Like many survivors, they didn't want to remember, they didn't want to talk about it. You know, you survived the war and you just moved on and tried to get on with your life. But my grandfather really wanted his children to know what happened. And there were times when I'd be working with him and his eyes would glaze over, and he would be back in Poland in the 40s, freezing cold, hungry, and he'd be telling me these stories and he'd be crying. And I was, you know, to see your grandfather cry is kind of crazy. And so I was in journalist mode. I was about the facts. So I would say, so you woke up next to a corpse, then what happened? Or they shot your father because he stepped out of line to get a sweater, then what happened? And it wasn't until I got home and started typing up these notes and these stories that I realized these were not notes, these were not stories, facts you read in a history textbook. This was my grandfather's personal experience. This was my family's history. And that's when I started getting emotional. So like I said, it took years to do, and my grandfather and I worked on this every couple months. You know, every once in a while he'd call me on the phone, how's the book? You know, now it was becoming a book. Now the pressure was really on. But there were so many books on the Holocaust, and now that I was thinking, oh, this might be a book, how can I make this different from so many other books? How can I make this different? I couldn't figure out what that was. Well, in 2008, my grandfather got cancer, and he had to have a kidney removed. And he calls me from the hospital. He's like, I'm 88, enough already, finish the book. Now, I don't know if you know about Jewish guilt, but I didn't take it as guilt. I took it as motivation because he wasn't getting any younger, and you know what, neither was I. I wanted to finish this for him, but what was missing? I couldn't figure that out. Well, it turns out, right around this time, I was invited to go to Szczecin, Poland, the town where my grandfather was from. They were having a Jewish festival. They were trying to reintroduce the Jewish culture back because there were no Jews there. So I called my grandfather and I said, I'm going back to Szczecin. He said, why? They hate Jews. I said, it's the 21st century. Don't worry. Don't worry. So I go and I'm with 17 other people, and we're all relatives of those who had lived in this town. We get off the bus. We're greeted by all these townspeople, and they're blonde and blue-eyed, and they looked at us as though they had never seen Jews before, because really there were no Jews in this town. When my grandfather lived there, there were 3,000 people, half of whom were Jews. But in 2008, not a single one. And first, before the festival, we go on a tour, and I see the temple where my grandfather had his bar mitzvah, and I'm remembering the story, but it's boarded up. It's going to be turned into a mall with no Jews. Who needs a temple? Finally, we come to this big grassy area, and I think, I wonder if my family came here on picnics with my grandfather and his brothers and his family. And as I'm thinking this, I'm told that this was where the Jews were gathered and selected when the Nazis came in, and they were lined up and chosen whether to go to a labor camp or a concentration camp. And where I was standing was where my grandfather stood when he was chosen to go the first of 4 labor camps and then 4 concentration camps. And it was where I was standing that he stood the last time he ever saw his family. So of course I'm getting a little choked up, and the tour goes on, and it finally ends, and it ends in front of these new public restrooms. Now, I was a tour guide in college. Why were we, you know, end a tour in front of restrooms? Why were we standing here? Well, it turns out these restrooms were significant. For in 2002, the town got a new mayor, and the mayor said, we need restrooms. Now, they could have put these restrooms anywhere. They weren't that big. Why right here? Well, right here was where the ancient Jewish cemetery was. And the mayor said, you know what, we're digging up the section. And they took the remains and they threw them in the garbage. And they took the headstones and they turned them into somebody's backyard patio. So it's at this moment, my hands are balled up into fists, I'm crying. The group, Jews and Polish, were all arm in arm, everybody's kind of hugging and lighting candles. And I realized at that moment what had been missing from the book, and that's what it had to do with me. Here I thought I was writing this book for my grandfather, but really I was writing it for me and my sisters and my niece and nephew, and for the thousands who've read the book, and hopefully, knock on wood, the thousands more who will read it. Because this is a story we cannot forget. I'm a member of a group called 3GNY, we're third generation, we're grandchildren of survivors. There's groups all over now sprouting up, and we go into classrooms and we tell our grandparents' stories so that we can tell you, because our grandparents can't come and do this. Now, my grandfather's going to be 93, still alive, and the two of us have spoken about a dozen times together in Florida. And I remember after one of the times we spoke to 200 fifth graders, and when we were done speaking, the kids ran up to him. They wanted to touch him and hug him and get their picture taken with him. And he's shrunk now. He's this little guy, and he still has an accent, and you couldn't get the smile off his face. And when we got out to the car after, he said, you know, I think we did something good. He was so excited. Now, right before this book came out, you guys have heard of YouTube, you've seen videos on YouTube. I got an email from a woman who said, I want to make a video about your tiny apartment. Now, I lived in an apartment that was 90 square feet, so I said, sure. She came, made the video. I didn't realize at the time the cover of the book was up on the screen. Well, the video went viral months later on YouTube. Millions and millions of people have seen the video, and at first I was getting emails that said, I love your little space, you're so organized, blah, blah, blah. A couple weeks later, the email started to sound like this. I read your book. Your grandfather was amazing. Thank you for telling this story. And these emails were coming from Australia, India, Italy, and Germany. So it really was amazing that we were able to touch so many people from a gift that I wrote for my grandfather. So I'm going to leave it with that, and we'll go on. Thank you. I'll do questions after if you want.